Europe's diplomatic spotlight shifted firmly to Copenhagen this weekend as EU foreign ministers gathered to debate one of the most divisive issues currently shaking the continent, whether to adopt sanctions on both Israel and Hamas over the ongoing war in Gaza. Among the measures under discussion was the possibility of suspending the EU-Israel trade deal, a step that, if agreed upon, would mark one of the bloc's boldest moves in years. The meeting came against the backdrop of months of violence in Gaza, with mounting civilian casualties, regional instability, and growing frustration within Europe at the inability of international diplomacy to halt the bloodshed. The ministers arrived in Denmark not only with their national perspectives, but also with the heavy responsibility of crafting a common European stance on a crisis that continues to polarize governments, parliaments, and publics across the continent. From the moment the first motorcades pulled into the Danish capital, it was clear that this gathering carried unusual gravity. Cameras captured EU Chief of Diplomacy Kaja Kallas speaking to reporters, her measured tone underscoring the seriousness of the moment. Soon after, foreign ministers from Finland, Austria, Greece, Sweden, Romania, Germany and Italy filed into the venue, pausing briefly to address the press before taking their seats around the negotiating table. The visual symbolism was unmistakable. Europe's top diplomats gathering under one roof, aware that their deliberations would resonate far beyond the walls of Copenhagen. The images of ministers greeting one another, exchanging brief words and preparing for hours of talks reflected both a sense of routine diplomacy and the weight of extraordinary circumstances. The French Foreign Affairs Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, was among the first to speak publicly, making a point of reminding Europe of the institutional principles at stake. His words, delivered firmly, invoked the founding spirit of the United Nations and carried a clear warning against undermining its universal character. Barrot said, "From this point of view, I want to remind you, following the announcements that have been made in recent hours, that the headquarters of the United Nations is a place of neutrality. It is a sanctuary in the service of peace where conflicts are resolved, wars are prevented, and that from this point of view, a General Assembly of the United Nations, founded 80 years ago by France, among other founding countries, cannot suffer from any restriction of access. And I would have the opportunity to express myself on this subject with my European colleagues. Thank you." His intervention was not only a nod to the past, but a sharp comment on the present. Recent restrictions on diplomatic access, particularly to Palestinian representatives, have sparked outrage in parts of Europe. For France, the UN remains sacrosanct, a venue where universality cannot be compromised, even in times of heightened security tensions. Barrot's framing set the tone for the French position in Copenhagen, an insistence that Europe defend international norms, resist unilateral restrictions, and emphasize neutrality in global institutions. Much of the conversation circled back to the humanitarian crisis. Reports of worsening shortages of food, medicine, and electricity in Gaza have sparked protests across European cities. Aid organisations have warned that the enclave faces collapse without immediate relief. Rasmussen's stark language captured the urgency. The time for rhetorical condemnation has passed. Tangible steps must follow. Several ministers argued that sanctions, while controversial, could be one way to pressure Israel into allowing greater humanitarian access. Others insisted that Europe should instead focus on boosting direct aid to Gaza and supporting mediation efforts through Egypt and Qatar. Beyond the policy debates, the very act of convening in Copenhagen carried symbolic weight. Denmark has long positioned itself as a mediator in international conflicts, and hosting the meeting reinforced its reputation as a country willing to bridge divides. The images of Rasmussen sitting alongside Kaja Kallas, the EU's chief diplomat, underscored the host nation's role in facilitating dialogue among sometimes fractious partners. Meanwhile, the presence of ministers from across the continent sent a broader message that despite disagreements, Europe remains committed to grappling with the Gaza conflict collectively. The optics of unity, even when policy consensus remains elusive, are themselves a form of diplomacy. As the ministers settled into their working session, expectations were tempered. Few anticipated a dramatic breakthrough or an immediate agreement on sanctions. Instead, the meeting was seen as part of a gradual process, a signal to both sides of the Gaza conflict that Europe is prepared to escalate pressure if conditions do not change. What is certain is that Europe cannot afford to remain a bystander. The war in Gaza has already spilled over into global debates about trade, migration, security, and diplomacy. With every passing week, the pressure on the EU to move from words to action, as Rasmussen put it, grows heavier. The Copenhagen gathering encapsulated Europe's struggle to find its voice on one of the defining crises of the decade. France, through Barrett, emphasised the sanctity of international institutions. Denmark, through Rasmussen, sounded the alarm on humanitarian disaster. Other ministers brought their own perspectives, shaped by history, geography and politics. What united them all, however, was the recognition that Europe cannot avoid hard choices any longer. Whether or not sanctions materialise, the debates in Copenhagen will reverberate in Brussels, in Tel Aviv, in Gaza and beyond. For now, the ministers have left Denmark with more questions than answers. But the urgency of their words and the images of their gathering made one thing clear. Europe's long-standing habit of cautious diplomacy may soon give way to something bolder.
And then loss, I'm not very optimistic because even the option that we propose, which is quite a lenient one.
Weil sich die Attacken in den letzten Tagen massiv verschärft haben mit über 20 Toten.
To make sure we continue the conversation and start the cluster one negotiation with countries. We support and are clear on the fact that the hostages will be...
Der deutsch-französische Motor läuft wieder. Wir haben exzellente...
From this point of view, I want to remind you, following the announcements that have been made in recent hours, that the headquarters of the United Nations is a place of neutrality. It is a sanctuary in the service of peace where conflicts are resolved, wars are prevented, and that, from this point of view, a General Assembly of the United Nations, founded 80 years ago by France, among other founding countries, cannot suffer from any restriction of access. And I would have the opportunity to express myself on this subject with my European colleagues. Thank you. Regarding Gaza, we are witnessing the most catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe. We have long been arguing that Israel should change its course, and we will do our utmost to find common ground. I don't think I reveal any secret by saying that there are nuances between the 27 countries in Europe. Our position is that we now must change words into action.
Countries in Europe, our position is that we now must change words into action.